I have watched Washington repeat the same analytical mistake for decades, and the ultimatum issued to Hamas is simply the latest iteration of a failure I recognize from inside the intelligence system. The premise is seductively simple. Hamas is told it has one choice: disarm, surrender its weapons, dissolve itself, or face annihilation. That framing plays well on television and reassures policymakers who crave clean lines and decisive endings. But intelligence does not work that way, and neither do insurgent organizations rooted in ideology, social networks, and long-term grievance. From my time analyzing non-state actors, I learned that ultimatums only function when the target believes survival is possible on the other side of compliance. Hamas does not. Its leadership, its fighters, and much of its support base understand disarmament not as a transition to peace, but as an irreversible path to arrest, assassination, or political extinction. That is not conjecture. It is a pattern observable in every insurgency I studied, from Palestinian factions in the 1982nd to jihadist movements after 2001. The intelligence failure begins when U.S. officials project state actor logic onto a militant organization that does not define success as governance, stability, or international legitimacy. Hamas measures survival in continuity of resistance, narrative dominance, and the ability to endure punishment while outlasting its adversary politically. When American officials speak of choices, they are really articulating their own desire for closure, not Hamas's operational calculus. This distortion is compounded by public messaging that suggests external Arab forces or regional boards will step in to enforce disarmament. No serious intelligence analyst believes armed groups embedded in dense civilian terrain voluntarily surrender their leverage to outsiders with no local legitimacy. Yet the narrative persists because it simplifies an ugly reality into a digestible script. Comply and peace follows, refuse and force solves the problem. The strategic consequence of this illusion is predictable. When Hamas refuses, as intelligence professionals should have anticipated, the refusal is framed as irrational defiance rather than as the expected outcome of the group's incentives and identity. That framing then justifies escalation while obscuring the original analytical error. The hard lesson here is not about Hamas's morality or Israel's security concerns. It is about how American intelligence is sidelined when policymakers demand binary answers to complex insurgent behavior. When intelligence becomes a prop for ultimatums rather than a tool for understanding, strategy collapses before the first shot is fired. What followed the ultimatum was a familiar corruption of intelligence, one I have seen too many times to dismiss as accidental. Once political leaders publicly declared that Hamas had been given a choice, the intelligence system was quietly pressured to validate that claim rather than interrogate it. Assessments about Hamas's internal cohesion, command, resilience, and willingness to disarm were reframed through optimistic assumptions that conveniently aligned with policy goals. Analysts know that Hamas operates as a hybrid organization with decentralized cells, redundant leadership, and a culture that anticipates decapitation strikes. None of that supports the idea that removing senior figures or tightening military pressure would trigger collective surrender. Yet public-facing narratives emphasize fractures within Hamas, declining popular support, and hypothetical scenarios in which external Arab actors would compel disarmament. This was not intelligence discovery. It was narrative selection. Intelligence that contradicted the preferred storyline was buried in footnotes or hedged with language that policymakers learned to ignore. I watched similar dynamics unfold in Iraq, where dissenting views on insurgent durability were labeled pessimistic, and in Afghanistan, where Taliban resolve was consistently underestimated because acknowledging it would have undermined claims of progress. In the Hamas case, intelligence estimates about civilian embeddedness and the political costs of sustained operations were downplayed, while speculative ideas about post-Hamas governance were elevated to the status of plausible outcomes. Media commentary amplified this distortion, repeating talking points about Phase 2 disarmament and regional enforcement mechanisms without interrogating their feasibility. That amplification created feedback pressure. Once the narrative entered the public bloodstream, intelligence agencies were incentivized to avoid assessments that might contradict official messaging. The strategic consequence was the loss of analytical honesty at precisely the moment it was most needed. Instead of informing leaders about the likely refusal and its downstream effects, prolonged conflict, humanitarian crisis, regional destabilization intelligence was reshaped to sustain the illusion that compliance remained possible. The analytical breakdown here is structural, not personal. Intelligence organizations are vulnerable when policymakers equate realism with disloyalty and optimism with patriotism. Analysts learn quickly which judgments are welcomed and which ones stall careers. Over time, this produces assessments that sound confident but rest on fragile assumptions. The hard lesson is stark. When intelligence is bent to fit the message, it ceases to function as early warning and becomes post hoc justification. In Gaza, as elsewhere, that transformation guaranteed strategic surprise, not because the outcome was unpredictable, but because acknowledging the obvious was politically inconvenient. By the time the ultimatum hardened into policy, Gaza was no longer being treated as an intelligence problem at all. It had become a managed narrative, an exercise in messaging discipline rather than situational awareness. I recognized the shift immediately. When officials stop asking what armed actors can do and start insisting on what they should do, intelligence is already being overridden. Gaza was recast in Washington as a post-conflict governance puzzle, complete with speculative boards, regional trustees, and security arrangements that existed only on briefing slides. None of this was grounded in intelligence reporting from the ground, which consistently highlighted fragmented authority, competing armed factions, clan loyalties, and the absence of any credible local force capable of enforcing disarmament without sustained coercion. Those realities were inconvenient because they undermined the story that Hamas's removal would naturally lead to stability. Instead, Gaza was framed as a vacuum waiting to be filled by moderate administrators once Hamas was pressured into submission or destroyed. That framing ignored decades of intelligence history, showing that power vacuums in contested territories do not remain empty. They are contested violently, often by actors more extreme and less controllable than their predecessors. I saw the same fantasy take hold in Libya after 2011 and in Iraq after the disbandment of the army. In each case, policymakers substituted governance concepts for intelligence judgments and then acted surprised when reality refused to cooperate. In Gaza, intelligence warnings about the durability of armed resistance and the legitimacy deficit of externally imposed authorities were overshadowed by narrative imperatives aimed at reassuring allies and domestic audiences. The strategic consequence was a widening gap between declared objectives and achievable outcomes. By treating Gaza as a communications problem, Washington signaled that perception management mattered more than operational truth. That signal was not lost on regional actors, who understood that American credibility now depended on sustaining a storyline rather than confronting fact. The analytical breakdown lies in the institutional habit of mistaking planning for control. Producing detailed post-conflict scenarios creates the illusion of mastery, even when there is no intelligence basis for believing those scenarios can be implemented. Intelligence officers are trained to assess capability, intent, and context. None of those supported the notion that Gaza could be smoothly transitioned through narrative-driven governance schemes. The hard lesson is that when policymakers manage narratives instead of intelligence, they end up fighting reality itself. Gaza did not become more predictable because Washington described a desired future. It became more volatile because decision makers convinced themselves that description was analysis. The belief that Hamas might disarm under pressure belongs to a category of analytical fantasies I learned to distrust early in my career. Disarmament is a political act, not a mechanical response to force, and intelligence history offers no serious support for the idea that ideologically driven militant organizations voluntarily surrender their weapons when those weapons are the sole source of their leverage and survival. I watched this misconception distort policy toward Hezbollah in Lebanon, where decades of military pressure failed to compel disarmament because the group's arms were inseparable from its identity and legitimacy. The same logic applied to the Taliban, whose willingness to endure punishment was consistently underestimated because officials measured pain in material terms, while the Taliban measured success in endurance and narrative persistence. Hamas fits squarely into this pattern. Its weapons are not merely tools, they are symbols of resistance, deterrence against rivals, and internal cohesion. Intelligence reporting has long shown that disarmament for such groups only occurs after political victory, internal collapse, or negotiated transformation that preserves some form of power. None of those conditions existed in Gaza. Yet the fantasy persisted because it offered a comforting endpoint, a scenario in which violence subsides not through compromise or stalemate, but through compliance. The strategic consequence of believing in this fantasy is escalation without resolution. When disarmament fails to materialize, policymakers conclude that pressure was insufficient rather than misdirected, leading to expanded operations that deepen civilian suffering and harden resistance. The analytical breakdown here is rooted in a failure to distinguish between coercion and compellence. Intelligence officers are trained to understand that coercion can impose costs, but compellence, forcing an adversary to take a specific action, requires altering incentives and perceptions in ways force alone rarely achieves against non-state actors. In Gaza, every increase in pressure reinforced Hamas's narrative that survival required continued resistance, validating its internal discipline and recruitment messaging. The hard lesson is that disarmament is not an outcome intelligence can will into existence by declaring it necessary. It is the product of political conditions that must be assessed honestly, not assumed. By clinging to the disarmament fantasy, Washington demonstrated once again how easily strategic thinking collapses when leaders confuse what they want to happen with what intelligence says can happen. The refusal that followed was not a surprise to anyone who understood the intelligence, but it carried consequences Washington pretended not to see. Once Hamas predictably rejected disarmament, the strategic path narrowed into a corridor defined by force, endurance, and regional risk. Intelligence professionals have long warned that sustained military operations in Gaza would not produce decisive outcomes, but would instead generate cascading effects that extend far beyond the immediate battle space. Those warnings were sidelined. The refusal was framed publicly as obstinacy, even madness, rather than as the rational behavior of an organization operating under siege conditions with no viable exit. The immediate consequence was the normalization of open-ended military operations, justified not as a choice, but as an inevitability. That framing masked the reality that prolonged campaigns in densely populated terrain inevitably produce civilian displacement, humanitarian crises, and international backlash. Intelligence reporting consistently showed that such conditions fuel recruitment, harden attitudes, and erode whatever residual legitimacy external actors hope to preserve. Regionally, the refusal sharpened fault lines that intelligence analysts had been tracking for years. Armed groups aligned with Hamas did not need direct orders to exploit the situation. The optics alone were sufficient to energize sympathetic networks across the region. The risk was never a single coordinated escalation, but a series of opportunistic actions calibrated to test red lines without triggering full-scale war. That is precisely the kind of gray zone environment intelligence officers are trained to anticipate, yet it was treated publicly as a secondary concern. The strategic consequence extended to U.S. credibility. By asserting that Hamas had been given a clear choice, Washington implicitly promised an outcome it could not deliver. When that outcome failed to materialize, the gap between rhetoric and reality widened, reinforcing the perception that American strategy is driven by declarations rather than control. The analytical breakdown lies in the refusal to acknowledge limits. Intelligence does not promise clean victories. It maps constraints and probabilities. In Gaza, the probability of refusal was always high, and the consequences of that refusal were always severe. Ignoring those assessments did not make them disappear, it merely ensured that policymakers would confront them unprepared. The hard lesson is that strategic credibility erodes not when adversaries refuse ultimatums, but when leaders issue ultimatums intelligence cannot support. Gaza became another case study in how refusing to plan for refusal is itself a strategic failure. By the time refusal hardened into stalemate, Washington's priority shifted almost entirely to narrative control, a move that confirmed intelligence had lost its seat at the table. I have seen this transition before, and it always follows the same pattern. When operational reality refuses to conform to declared objectives, policymakers double down on messaging rather than reassess assumptions. In Gaza, this meant repeating claims about progress, deterrence, and inevitable outcomes, while intelligence reporting grew more cautious, more conditional, and less visible. The gap between what was said publicly and what was known privately widened into a credibility chasm. Operationally, the situation remained stubbornly resistant to decisive change. Hamas retained enough command continuity to function, alternative governance structures failed to gain traction, and civilian suffering continued to dominate international perception. None of this was ambiguous from an intelligence standpoint. What changed was how much of that reality was allowed to shape policy discussion. Narrative discipline became a substitute for a strategic adjustment. Officials spoke as if repetition could impose order on events, as if saying the same things louder would eventually make them true. The strategic consequence was the erosion of trust, not just among adversaries, but among allies and neutral observers who could see the mismatch between claims and conditions. Intelligence analysts understand that credibility is cumulative and fragile. Once audiences conclude that statements are designed to sustain appearances rather than describe reality, every subsequent claim is discounted. The analytical breakdown here reflects a deeper institutional pathology, the belief that controlling the story can control outcomes. Intelligence exists to warn against that illusion. It deals in probabilities, not certainties, and in trade-offs, not slogans. In Gaza, operational reality imposed constraints that messaging could not erase. Civilian harm amplified resistance narratives, prolonged operations strained political capital, and regional actors recalibrated based on observed behavior rather than stated intent. The hard lesson is that narrative control is not strategy. It is a defensive reflex that emerges when leaders are unwilling to confront the implications of their own decisions. Intelligence officers are trained to accept bad news early because it preserves options. When that discipline is abandoned in favor of optimistic storytelling, options disappear. Gaza illustrated this dynamic with painful clarity. The more Washington insisted it was in control, the more evidence accumulated that it was reacting, not shaping. The final lesson is the one intelligence institutions keep learning and then forgetting under political pressure. When policymakers demand certainty and moral clarity, intelligence is quietly transformed into fiction. Gaza did not expose a sudden failure of analysis. It revealed a long-standing unwillingness to accept what analysis consistently showed. Hamas was never going to disarm because disarmament offered it no survivable future. Gaza was never going to transition cleanly because legitimacy cannot be imported or narrated into existence. Ultimatums were never going to produce compliance because they were issued to an actor that measures success by endurance, not acceptance. These were not obscure insights. They were embedded in decades of intelligence reporting on insurgencies, non-state actors, and asymmetric warfare. What collapsed was not knowledge, but the institutional courage to let that knowledge shape decisions. I have watched intelligence be politicized in different ways over the years. Sometimes it is exaggerated to justify war. Other times it is softened to sustain optimism. In Gaza, it was simplified to preserve a narrative of control. That simplification came at a cost. American credibility eroded because foreign audiences no longer judged U.S. statements against intent, but against observable outcomes. When those outcomes diverged repeatedly from declared objectives, trust collapsed. Allies adjusted quietly. Adversaries adjusted openly. Populations drew their own conclusions. The strategic consequence extends beyond Gaza. In a multipolar world, narrative dominance is no longer monopolized by Washington. Competing powers do not need to defeat American forces to undermine American influence. They only need to highlight the gap between what the United States says and what it can actually deliver. The analytical breakdown that enabled this outcome was rooted in the refusal to accept limits. Intelligence exists to define those limits, not to eliminate them. When leaders treat intelligence as an obstacle rather than a guide, they trade temporary political comfort for long-term strategic damage. The hard lesson is not about Hamas, Israel, or Gaza alone. It is about the collapse of an American strategic narrative that once rested on credibility, realism, and disciplined assessment. When intelligence becomes a supporting character in a pre-written story, strategy loses its anchor. What remains is motion without direction, force without resolution, and words that no longer persuade. That is not a failure of intelligence professionals. It is a failure to listen to them